Good morning. Okay, there, good. Welcome to the last panel of the 2006 American Constitution Society Convention. The truth is that you've all been actually on a reality show, and you are the last survivors sitting here. This is our way of ferreting out the truest and bluest, I guess, ACS diehards. So congratulations to all of you. Your reward is an absolutely A-list panel this morning on closing the economic wealth gap. I'm Goodwin Liu. I teach at Bolt Hall at UC Berkeley, and I'm also on the ACS Board of Directors. I also want to say Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there, and thank all of you who have chosen to spend it with us. Let me say brief words of introduction about the panelists, but you have all the bios in your program, so I'm not going to go into any length about it. To my immediate left is Judy Scott, who is a partner at James & Hoffman Law Firm, also the counsel to the Service Employees International Union, the SEIU. To her left is Alan Jenkins, the Executive Director of the Opportunity Agenda, formerly Director of Human Rights at the Ford Foundation, clerk for Justice Blackmun, and also worked in the Solicitor General's office. To his left is Judy Lichtman, a virtual fixture in the women's movement for 30-plus years, formerly Director of the National Partnership for Women and Families, and a longtime friend to ACS. And then finally, to her left, the Dean of our delegation, Peter Edelman. Many long years in this set of issues. He's a professor at Georgetown Law School, as well served under the Clinton administration in very senior positions in the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm going to do just a quick introduction to these issues, and what we're going to do is essentially three things this morning. I'll provide a basic, a very basic sketch of the picture of inequality that exists in the country as we sit here today, and some trend lines over the last 30 years. Although the title of the panel is Wealth Inequality, we're sort of broadening the lens to talk more broadly about economic inequality. Secondly, we will spend some time diagnosing the causes and explanations of the inequality that we see and the trend line. And then third, we'll spend some time talking about policies and solutions. Okay? So to the first task, very quickly, if I could offer you a sketch of the picture of inequality, I'll do it something like this. If you just imagine the population out there divided into quintiles, which is what a lot of demographers and social scientists do. So you have, groups 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Consider group 1, folks who we would think of as poor, group 3, the middle, as the true middle class, and then group 5 as the rich. So in 2001, the average income of the middle class was about $51,000. This was 3.5 times the average income of the poor, which was about $15,000. And this ratio has not changed very much over the past 2 decades. In 1979, the income of the middle class was about 3.3 times the income of the poor. In 2001, the income of the rich, the fifth quintile, made, this was about $183,000, about 3.5 times the middle class and over 12 times the poor. By contrast, the income of the rich was only 2.6 times the middle class and 8 times the income of the poor in 1979. Moreover, among the rich, so think within the slice of the top 20%, there are enormous differences. The top quarter of the rich made twice as much as the merely rich, and the top 1% of the rich made nearly 10 times the income of the merely rich, compared to only 5 times that income in 1979. What's most astounding, I think, is that between 1979 and 2000, the nation's aggregate income did grow, But the rising tide did not lift all boats equally. The poor captured less than 1% of that income growth over the last 2 decades. The middle, 20%, the middle class captured 5%, and the rich captured 74% of the aggregate income growth of the country over the last 20 years. In fact, over half of that amount, about 38% of the nation's total income growth, was captured by the top 1% of households in the country. So if you think about the curve that's drawn here, you can imagine if you arrayed everyone on a curve, you'd have a midpoint, and then you'd have to the left of the curve a regular sort of bell-shaped, pretty compact distribution to the left. But to the right, you'd have this very long right tail going way out to the far side of the room. And there are important racial differences in this panoply of inequality. The median black and median Latino income was only 62% of the household income of whites. And whereas 1 out of 10 white people are poor, almost 1 out of 4 blacks and Latinos are poor. But it's important to remember that among people who are poor, the largest group are white. Okay? If you look at wealth, now I shift the frame from income to wealth, the disparities are even bigger. The top 20% of families owned 84% of the nation's wealth in 2001. This is defined as family net worth. The top 1% alone owned over 1/3 of all wealth in the country. The median white family had 10 times as much wealth as the median black family in 2001. The rate of home ownership among blacks and Latinos is only about 50%, whereas among whites it's about 70%. And all of this we might think would be fair, in a sense, if we had some genuine equality of opportunity at the starting line of life, and people then segmented themselves according to their efforts and their achievements. But the reality is, if you look at education, for example, there are wide disparities in certainly the achievement gap, but also in the amount of resources that are spent on K-12 education throughout the country. This is especially true if you look from state to state. In real terms, states like New York, Wisconsin, and Connecticut spend over 50% more per pupil than states like California, Arizona, and Mississippi. This geographic pattern is one that disfavors poor and minority kids. One interesting thing to note is that the United States is highly exceptional in terms of its inequality when you look on an international sphere. So the United States has the highest level of inequality in earnings, for example, among all the nations in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The United States also has the highest level of child poverty among all OECD nations, about 17%, about 1 out of 6 kids. And what's really interesting is that if you look at OECD nations, there is a virtually linear and negative relationship between social expenditures and the percentage of kids in poverty. So in countries like Italy, Canada, and the United States, which spend about 3 to 6% of their GDP on social programs, child poverty is 15% or greater. But if you look at countries like Finland, Norway, and Sweden, which spend about 13 to 17% of their GDP on social expenditures, they have child poverty rates of less than 5%. So this is the context in which this panel is sort of situated. So we're going to spend some time exploring the causes, explanations of the growing trend of inequality, especially over the last 30 years, which I would add is aberrant when compared to the 30 years previous to the most recent 30 years. In the period from the post-war period from 1945 to about 1975, all the quintiles in the income distribution grew at roughly the same rate in terms of their income. So the growth that the nation experienced was widely shared by all groups. And so against that backdrop, the last 30 years is really a dramatic departure from what we've had. I'm going to turn first to Peter Edelman, who has not only seen the last 30 years, but has participated in policy making and sometimes legal efforts on a variety of fronts, and pose just a very general question, which is, how do we explain what's happening in this growing trend towards increasing inequality?
Thank you, Goodwin. Sunday morning and Father's Day and Grandfather's Day and all of that, seeing all of you who are here as well. All of you are certainly clear policy wonks to be up on Sunday morning. Joe Onyx's grandchildren are out in San Francisco, so he doesn't count. But we'll get to our grandchildren, won't we?
We will today.
I think that the short answer, and of course it's brilliant of me to be allowed to point this out, or brilliant of you to turn to me, is low-wage work. Now that doesn't account for the other end of what you were talking about, which is the growth of the super wealth at the other end, which is a separate issue in causation, I think, that exacerbates the problem greatly. But we could actually, we've got plenty of money and plenty of ability to do something about the low wage end, even if we didn't attack the high wealth end. I would propose doing both, obviously, but they go together in terms of our having given away the ability to get some of the resources we need from the high end through the tax system. But otherwise, I think analytically they're somewhat separate. 1973 is as most of us know, is a watershed year, an oil shed year. The first squeeze on us because of energy prices. What happened that year, which is so dramatic in the statistics, had been brewing for a long time. Had already started to lose good jobs overseas. We'd been losing good jobs regionally within the country. They'd been moving around and gone from being unionized jobs in the north to non-unionized in the south, and so on. But somehow that year just catalyzed everything. It all came together in a very negative way. And of course, globalization figures in this story in a major way, because one of the major reasons that things took off in the wrong direction was because so many good jobs went abroad. There were also loss to technology. Our unemployment situation, well, it got worse during the period of stagflation, during the period of the 1980s. In fact, has gotten a lot better without the wage situation getting very much better. So people are working. There's a lot of disguised unemployment, of course. People are working, but they're not making enough to live on. If you look at those numbers, you pointed out that, in fact, the nation's income and wealth had grown a great deal over the last 30-plus years, the last generation, but it's all stuck at the top. The median wage job pays, if you have it, all year long. In other words, half the jobs in the country are below in wage about what below the number I'm about to say. That number, if you have that job all year long, is around $28,000. It's around $13 an hour, give or take, in current dollars, and it's only a tiny bit bigger than it was in 1973, and that tiny bit is wholly attributable to the last half of the 1990s. That's the only good, relatively good period that we had for lower income people. So think about that. Now there are lots of two-wage households, and that's not always because it's usually mom is the second earner in a two-wage household, although not always. But sometimes mom went to work because she wanted to, sometimes because she had to in order to get enough income into the household. If you look at this overall situation, so much more low-wage work, poverty and near poverty being so much more a function of wages rather than non-work at all than it was 30-plus years ago. It seems to me that we have a tremendous challenge for public policy and politics in this, and I know we'll get to this later on, but I just want to introduce it. Because the question is not only poverty. Our poverty line is it's measured in a totally idiotic and silly way in this country. It's a line $15,000 or so for a family of three. You can't possibly live on that in the vast most of this country. And the real line that we should be talking about is the line for everybody in this country to have an adequate income, a decent income, a living income, based mainly on work. And we have not gotten that across in a politically salient way. The number of people who have trouble paying their bills every month as a consequence of this history of people being stuck at the lower end, which, as you say, was not true from 1945 to the early 70s. That number of people is something on the order close to 3 times the number of the 37 million who we say are in poverty. So if 90 to 100 million people are in real economic trouble in this country, and there's no politics associated with that, there is something wrong with this picture.
Thank you, Peter. There are many, you mentioned many different strands, I think, of the explanation of the labor market, globalization, unionization, the skills issue, technology. I want to try to drill down into each of these, I think, in a little more depth. Let me turn to Judy. You know, unionization, I think that the story has been, this Judy, Judy Scott. In 1973, something on the order of 1/4 of the American workforce was unionized, but that has fallen to half that level, about 12.5% over the last 30 years. What role has that played in structuring the inequality picture that I described?
That role has, the decline in unionization has played an enormous role. And I think that's an incredibly important piece of this overall puzzle. And if you look at 1953, we're looking at something like 32% of the labor force organized. And now, as you said, when 12.5% of the workforce, and actually if you look at the private sector, it's actually about 8%. If you go back and look at, when we think of this in a larger perspective, auto jobs coming in the early 30s, these were not inherently well-paid jobs with health care and pensions. They became that through the worker movement and through the United Auto Workers and the unionization and the ability of workers to sit down at the bargaining table and have negotiations over how they shared the wealth of that corporation. As the ability of workers to sit down and use collective bargaining or worker representation vehicles to talk about how you divide the pie, as that has declined, so have declined wages, health care benefits. You look at studies, for example, the Economic Policy Institute, you can go on their website, and they put out a study in 2003 about the union differential that it plays, excuse me, am I getting a, that it plays in the ability of, number one, there's a huge difference between, if you look at industries and comparative industries, between non-union and union worker in terms of the amount of money that they're going to be paid for that job. It somewhere ranges, I think I brought the statistics with me, something like 28 to 18% higher wages if you're in a union job. You go to other issues of wealth, which, for example, health care coverage. You're looking at another huge differential of something like 28 to 50% differential there, again with pension coverage, defined pension coverage, which is going down as we're watching that system fall into demise, but it's very much tied to the ability of workers to have a union at their workplace to talk about the division and the distribution of wealth. We look at unionization, and I think we've lost the ability in this country to discuss it this way, but it's really been the most effective anti-poverty program we've had. It's been the ability of workers to come and have some voice and ability to impact the distribution of wealth at their work site or in their industry. And so you're going to see, I think, whether you look at the EPI or you look at the fact that the Human Rights Watch report that recently came out on the unfair advantage, the fact that our labor laws have failed us in the U.S., you're going to see as the union numbers have gone down, so have gone down the ability of workers to get a fair share at the workplace. I'd like to just wrap that up with a sort of a startling comparison. Peter had talked about the growth of low-wage workers, and we recently had an organizing success in the South with Houston janitors. But if you look at when we came into the Houston market at the Service Employees International Union, which, by the way, we have grown over the last several years. We are the fastest growing union. We've gone from, when I started with SEIU in 1996, to about 1 million members. We're now at 1.8 million members, many of those focused on low-wage worker sectors. But when you look at the Houston situation, these are people doing the same job. You compare the wage level. New York, the average pay, high union density market, $21.42 with full family health care coverage. You go to LA, which we recently organized, it's gone up to $10.65 per hour with full family health care. Chicago, $13.30, another union market. Philadelphia, $13.31. Again, both of these markets with family health care coverage. And then you go to Houston, they're paying $5.30 an hour with no health care coverage. So you've got a stark profile there of what it means to have a union market and the ability. Again, you're dealing with a lot of the same national employers. These are actually national cleaning contractors as the industry has really merged and consolidated, paying one rate for that job in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and a union much higher. Go to Houston and people are living in stark poverty.
I want to follow up with one question about that, but before I do, I forgot to remind everybody that if you have questions for the panel, please write them on a sheet of paper in front of you, and there will be staff circulating to pick up questions, and we'll come back to the audience questions at the end of the panel. The follow-up question I want to ask Judy is, given the decline in unionization, that trend, are you optimistic that that can ever be reversed in a significant way, or must policy discussion in some sense operate within fairly confined restraints of that trend?
Well, I've been doing this for over 30 years, so I would say I'm the ultimate optimist on this question. But it is something that, obviously, that's what we're all about here in these rooms and this conference over time, about how are we going to change these trends in the United States. I know we're going to be talking about different federal and state and local policies that can make a difference, but I want to, if we don't get to it, I just want to throw out one issue that is near and dear to my heart as we look at these questions, and Peter raised the globalization issue. And what I think we have failed tremendously in the progressive movement is the issue of how we discuss trade and look at trade. Trade, it's been this whole question of the free market versus, knee-jerk trade barriers. And, and we have not, for some reason, the progressive movement has not been willing to sort of drill down deeper and discuss what makes sense in a global economy for integrating economies and dealing with the huge disparity of wages and working conditions across the world, so that everybody benefits, workers across the world benefit in things going up rather than competing so things go down. There's only been one trade agreement in the United States ever really that's had an effective labor enforcement, and that was the Cambodian trade agreement that was negotiated in 1999. It had incentives for people to have to recognize labor standards. Cambodia, if in their garment industry, if they honored the ILO standards and could prove that they had effective enforcement for labor standards, they were able to get a bonus in terms of the amount of garments they could export. That happened, and what transpired as a result over a number of years was the birth of a very vibrant trade union movement among 200,000 garment workers in Cambodia. I was in Cambodia at a time when the impact of something like that on a country of that size is enormous. And what happened is the hotel industry, which is birthing in Cambodia with the tourist industry being welcomed in around Angkor Wat and other locations, 5-star hotels. All of a sudden, the hotel workers are organizing, and they had a very effective strike about the wages and the ability to compare and to increase people's wages in those locations. And so you had a trade policy that really started to deal with these questions where the U.S. played an important role, as opposed to one with NAFTA, where we did not deal with the fact that we are trying to integrate economies, and instead of doing what the European Union did, which was invest money in Ireland, invest money in Portugal, invest money in Spain, we had a situation where we did not do any investment in Mexico in terms of making sure human rights standards and labor standards and putting money into the economic development of Mexico itself. And as a result, we've had displacement of many workers in Mexico, no longer being able to work the farms, losing their jobs to our mega agricultural industries. There's a whole analysis here that I think we have failed in the progressive movement to look at, and how it plays a role in the globalization. And I'd just like to commend people to Jeff Foe's new book called Global Class War, where he discusses these whole trends and does an excellent job sort of talking about the policy matters that are indicated as a result.
Jeff is not outside signing copies of his book, but if you wish to buy one, you might go to the local bookstore. Let me bring Alan Jenkins into this discussion and stay with this topic of globalization, because I imagine both in your current work and in your former role at the Ford Foundation, you often grappled with issues of how globalization can be made compatible with human rights. Are we at a point, I mean, in some sense, globalization is a phenomenon that's here to stay. Are we at the mercy, in some sense, of these large forces, and how can those forces be steered in the ways that Judy mentioned to be made more compatible with particularly bringing up the bottom end of our income distribution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would first say, leading into that conversation, that it's important. I think it's appropriate that we've been talking primarily about labor rights and labor standards and living wages, but it's important to recognize that the United States has disinvested in all kinds of vehicles that have been very important to economic mobility and equality. So when you think about affordable housing, economic security protections like health care, access to college, these are all things that the country has invested in the past, and we've seen great leaps forward in terms of economic opportunity and the reduction of inequality. And they're things that we've turned away from. And not coincidentally, the country has turned away from them just as people of color, and to a large extent, women, were being fully integrated into those systems. And I would say to a lesser extent, the same has been true of unions. That certainly unions have been very important to African American mobility and advancement. But really, as people of color have been fully integrated into the unions, and recently the leadership of unions, the enforcement of labor rights by the federal government has been relinquished. And of course, the racial character of the integration has not been the only reason that the United States has moved away from those protections, but it's an important reason. So I wanted to start there. The second point I would make, and this was responsive to your question, is really about the global trade regime. Certainly globalization is not going anywhere, and in fact, Jeff Foe and others would say, and they're right, that globalization isn't a new phenomenon. There have been waves of globalization, and in fact, there have been periods in our history where globalization, by some measures, was at a higher rate than it is today. What's troubling is that, primarily for me, there was a global regime and set of rules that the vast majority of the countries of the world, have agreed to, and it's the international human rights regime. And the global trade regime has been allowed to trump that. And so, as Judy says, there are very few global trade agreements that even give deference to human rights, much less actually incorporate them. The same is, of course, true of labor rights, which are part of the human rights regime, and of environmental protections. And so this is something that in many ways has been unrecognized, that the idea that the international human rights regime, which is, remember, supposed to be about the basic protections that all human beings need in order to preserve their dignity and equality as individuals, have been trumped by a global trade regime, which is essentially about jobs in terms of the United States' participation and global markets. And that, the story is supposed to aid human development. Well, if we already have a system in place that goes to the basics that people need in order to preserve their human development and dignity, it's extremely troubling that we've allowed a global trade regime to trump that. And so just to give you a formal example, the global trade regime, NAFTA, and other agreements that we've entered into actually can provide sanctions for countries that give preference to rights-respecting trade industries and nations. And that's a remarkable development. That if you were to say, well, we're going to sanction or put tariffs on trade from Burma, Myanmar, because of slave labor, that it's quite possible that as a nation we could run into trade sanctions. That's something, that's a very straightforward change that should be made immediately and certainly should be incorporated into all future trade agreements.
Perfect. Let me bring Judy Lichtman into the discussion as well. Judy, the growth of aggregate income over the past 30 years has been due, I think, in no small part to the longer phenomenon of the entry of women into the labor force at a significantly higher rate, say, today than 50 years ago. To what extent has that phenomenon helped or hurt inequality? To the extent that women have made it into the labor force in increasing numbers, has that been mostly a kind of a phenomenon that has helped level the household income across the country in a way that makes it less severe than it otherwise would be? Or has that been mostly an uphill struggle in terms of the existing wage structure getting worse and fighting against that in the way that, as Alan said, policies have sort of turned away from policies of equality even as women have entered the labor force?
Well, I think probably the most honest answer is that it's a combination of both those things. Because as women entered the labor force in very significant numbers, it masks economic inequality certainly in low-wage worker families, and probably the same is true in middle-income families. I'm struck by our conversation today, coming from a long history of working on women's legal rights. Often the question in the context of reproductive rights is who decides. And I was struck this morning by the question of who provides. As many of my colleagues up here have suggested, we have had, for a combination of reasons, a real shift from employer-provided basket of benefits that made the livable wage livable with respect to health care and retirement security, and even to some extent education opportunities. At the very same time that government is disinvesting in those three crucial areas, and Alan would quite aptly add housing as well. When I came to what was called in 1974 the Women's Legal Defense Fund, everybody had these big buttons that had the international no sign superimposed upon 59 cents, and women earned 59 cents for every dollar a man earned. We weren't very sophisticated in 74, I'm embarrassed to tell you, so we had no way of disaggregating that number. It was women. Today, I can tell you, we're a tad bit more sophisticated. That number has gone up in the 32 years that I've been around, that number has gone up to about 76 or 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. But I can disaggregate it today. And I can tell you that white women, which in part gets to your question and how women in the workplace mask continuing inequality, white women earn about 86, 87 cents. African American women, 59 cents. So that button, 32 years, you could roll out that button. Hispanic women, even less, about 54, 55 cents, and Asian American women somewhere between those two numbers. So we have both come very far as women economic providers in this country, and we have very far to go. And if you disaggregate that number, it is a very telling picture of the confluence of race and gender in this country, which I think we have to continue to be ever mindful about.
I want to further develop your point about the disaggregation and invite Alan, too, to comment, and Peter. Is poverty still deeply racialized in America? Does poverty have a non-white face in America? And to what extent does that play into the politics, even through what you saw, Peter, during the Clinton administration and even through the current day?
As you said earlier, Goodwin, if you look at the actual numbers in absolute terms, there are more white people, non-Hispanic white people, who are poor than all the other groups combined. I think that's right, or at least it's a high plurality. But it's been true, certainly since I've had a consciousness about it, that politically poverty is racialized. And statistically, it's certainly true that as you mentioned the numbers earlier, African Americans, Latinos, certain groups of Asian Americans, Native Americans are all poor and extrapolate up, low-wage workers at vastly higher rates, at much higher, disproportionately higher rates than whites. So, well, you would think that we would be able to develop, and I would still hope, because I'm an inveterate optimist like Judy and like all of us, you can't be around this stuff on a continuing basis if you're not. One would hope that we could get across the idea that there's common ground here, as we should be doing in a lot of things. I think that a politics based on the common good would do us all, would improve our situation for all of us, at the same time that it preserves the attention and importance of individual racial issues. So we need to unpack and see and be honest about the facts of race and ethnicity and gender in these issues. We need to put them out there on the table. Not just those basic numbers about poverty disproportionality, low wage disproportionality, but what's going on here? Guess what? Racism still exists in this country. Not the whole reason. We need to understand about structural racism or institutional racism, and many of these issues apply to women, apply to Latinos, others as well. But certainly, concentrated poverty, which is more a factor in the African American community than any place else, is deadly. Children go to the worst schools. There's essentially a cradle-to-prison pipeline. And of course, in addition to wrecking those individual lives, it produces those statistics that we talked about before. So we need to honestly flip our concern about education. That's where we need affirmative action, if you will, for 5-year-olds. And invest in making sure that every child which means disproportionately children of color and poverty, that they're all ready for school by age 5, that the schools they attend have the best teachers. You can certainly do that with incentive structures that we don't now do, and on through paying attention to the criminal justice system, which operates in a disparately racial way, and we could get into the details. So absolutely, the question of race, our national attitudes about race, and then never to forget what goes with it, that is to say, these questions of gender and ethnicity as well. It has to be on the table in this discussion.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'd just add a couple of quick points. I think Peter has really laid it out extremely well. Just two kind of interesting examples. One, in terms of the racialization of the idea of poverty, this notion that when Americans think of a poor person, the picture in their head is not white, and typically not white women, who I think are also the plurality of groups who are amongst the poor. There's a chilling book that came out in the late 90s called Why Americans Hate Welfare that actually looked at social science research about attitudes and found that when you put an African American especially face on a policy and describe it to U.S. audiences, they're drastically less likely to support the policy than if you put literally and figuratively put a white face on it. You explain what AFDC was and say, do you support it or not? And there's a photograph that goes along with it, and support goes down. And that's a very important part of this debate, and figuring out ways to address that bias and the bias that attaches to social policies is very important. The second is just to put a kind of specific on these issues of discrimination. So a good example in the housing context is that people of color, and this includes all non-whites, experience about discrimination in housing about 22% of their encounters. So in other words, about almost a quarter of the time that a person of color seeks to rent or purchase housing, they're either steered, not given accurate information, told nothing's available. And yet housing, and particularly home ownership, has been the most important aspect of wealth building and mobility for Americans generally. And that's something that exists today. So that's not even to get into the issues of structural inequality that Peter has addressed. For instance, the building of the suburbs in a way that overtly excluded people of color and that is perpetuated without needing any new acts of discrimination in order to exclude, although those acts still exist.
And we should be clear, Goodwin, that much of this is absolutely deliberate on the part of the conservative strategy going back to the defeat of Barry Goldwater. Because the minute it became unacceptable to use the N-word or the corresponding words for other groups, what happened was a strategy, a Southern strategy, remember that, of racial politics that was embodied in welfare, the politics of welfare and crime. It's no accident that Ronald Reagan's welfare queen evoked a black image on the part of many, many people, millions of people in this country. It was quite deliberate on his part. Willie Horton was a black man. And those things have been really not answered effectively by our side over these years.
I'd like to add, though, in this whole discussion is the importance of the question of the split within working people on this issue, and the importance that we sort of make sure that the common ground, that when we look at industrial America, so many white workers who came through, let's say, are now retired with the retiree health care or the pension coverage, this is all now being eaten away, and many, many people across racial lines in the working class have lost health care coverage, have lost pension coverage. And so the basic issues about economic security, we have to really, come together on the questions that these as Judy said, the employers are just completely, along with the government, abandoning these areas and are leaving workers on their own to come up with how are they going to cover themselves on health care and how are they going to somehow figure out how to get some kind of retirement security. When we polled young workers now, the one thing they identify as their key issue they're concerned about is debt. People don't really think that they're going to have wealth in America. They don't necessarily think they're going to buy a home, or their kids are going to be better off than they were, which were in the past. They are concerned that they can get themselves out of debt. And that's what they would consider an achievement. And so we really are at this point, I think really having to look at those vehicles that we can do. And I'd like to say to people in this room, there are things we can do right now. I mean, at SEIU, we've said, okay, maybe we're not going to get federal labor law reform this year. So, okay, what's left? And we're not just going to give up. And so, frankly, we have a lot of people, it's interesting in the legal department where I work, we don't have many people focused anymore on the federal labor laws. They're looking at state and local initiatives of how do you empower workers to have a voice in the workplace. Many people are abandoned completely by coverage of the National Labor Relations Act. So we have created vehicles for, let's say, in the home care workers who are considered independent contractors, who have no voice at work. We created statutes that allowed them to create an employer model, for example, in California, where 80,000 LA County home workers voted to have a union through a different representation process than the National Labor Relations Act, so that they could bargain over how much they are paid to take care of their clients. We have recently had, for example, in Illinois, the governor give us an antitrust exemption waiver so that child care workers, mostly women of color, living in poverty, taking care of children to $7 to $9 a child per day, could actually elect to have a worker representative, a union, and negotiate with the state over child care reimbursement rates. We are trying these models out through ballot initiatives in Washington State, in Oregon, in a whole variety of areas. And I would really urge those law students in the audience to really start sort of taking advantage that there is now a real look at what we can do with state and local initiatives to really give people vehicles to bring themselves out of poverty and have a collective voice, whether it be through a living wage, health insurance initiatives on the state and local level with these big box ordinances that provide and require health care, to these vehicles we're working with on how do you give representation to people who have been traditionally called independent contractors and shut out of the system entirely.
Let me, this is a marvelous segue to beginning to talk about some solutions. But I want to pull in the other tail of the problem for 1 second. We've been focusing a lot on the line, say, between folks who are who don't even have a stake in the community and the middle class. So that line is one that is particularly socially salient for obvious reasons. But there is another half of this inequality equation, the right tail that goes way far out to the end of this room. And when you look at that, one question that I think comes immediately to mind is, why is there not a greater political consensus, a majoritarian consensus about the injustice of that kind of inequality? Is it just that most Americans, contrary to what Judy just said, believe that they might one day end up in that far right tail? And if that's so, is that a good aspiration that people have, or are people just deluding themselves?
Well, I don't know if you were going to direct it at me, but I'll
try my hand. I am looking at you, Jim.
I'll try my hand at it first. Well, your question, I think, in some ways goes to a conundrum that we in the progressive community who have worked in the area of public policy have tried to attend to over very many decades, and that is whether or not the policies that we advocate on behalf of are universal in coverage or targeted to the poor and the near poor. And it's the age-old, in a sense, the Medicaid debate. It's a Social Security debate. And I think I'm, along with all my other colleagues up here, claim to the mantle of being an optimist, mostly because I know for sure I'm not a masochist, and I figure I'd go do something else if I wasn't positive there was going to be some great breakthrough pretty soon. I'm, having said that, desperately displeased, for lack of a better way to say it, with the vast numbers of people who support repeal of the estate tax. And they do so, the social science polling people keep telling me, because they think someday they're going to be so overwhelmingly rich, despite the fact that young people are worried about debt at the same time, that they think they're going to aspire to the economic class of people who are going to be protected by the repeal of the estate tax. Well, I don't think we progressives have figured out a way to deal with this conundrum. Having said what I just said about the estate tax, at least I think we were able to forestall it for the moment this past week, which goes to my optimism. I want to sort of circle backward to an earlier question to me, and something I neglected to say about the masking of inequality by women coming into the workplace in huge numbers. And that is, we as a nation of workplaces never accommodated family realities of two-earner incomes. And so
let alone single
yes, and single earner income families, to be sure. And so the disproportionate fallout on families, single earner and dual income families, with respect to the failure of public policy, we have all the rhetoric of being a family-friendly place as a nation, and we have none of either the employment policies or the government policies in place to make that a reality. So women have come into the workplace, but at great cost both to themselves and families, economic cost.
You know, John Edwards talked about two Americas, good one. And I think some of this has been has been that some of our friends have not been as forthcoming and exercised the leadership that they might have. Money in politics has an awful lot to do with this. You know, the fact that you have to butter up, to use a more polite term, these very, very wealthy people to get the money that you need to run. So I remember when somebody in the 1980s in Congress gave just the mildest talk about the rich paying their fair share or something like that, and a Democrat stood up on the House floor and said, "Let's not start class warfare here." Well, I thought that was about let's not anger the people that are giving us the money. So, you know, this is a hard one. We all know it's a hard one. And McCain-Feingold was an effort, but there's a long way to go in that. And every time we close one hole in that area, three more open up through clever people. So we just have to, all I can say is maybe find a different way of talking about it. I think that Bill Gates Sr. has been absolutely fabulous in this estate tax debate, but speaking more generally about what the wealthiest people really owe to this country in terms of it having enabled them to succeed in the way they have, and they would not have had they been in a country that doesn't have our stable markets and our stable government and stable set of institutions. So maybe our leadership, people who run for office, can find some different ways. Again, it's the common good.
I have about 20 questions in front of me, which is a good sign that all of you are awake and engaged. I'm going to try to pile about 5 questions together in one question. And I think it goes something like this. Many of you have asked, and I think it's a very good question as we move to talking more about solutions. In terms of framing, and this picks up right where you left off, Peter, in terms of framing, how do you counter the observation that all this inequality that we've been talking about is, in some sense, too bad, but it is just a kind of inevitable result of the market processes in the global environment in which we live? What is the counter story about the sort of natural outcome of the market?
The counter story is that the untrammeled operation of the market will deeply injure most Americans in some way or another. But really, most Americans would be hurt if there were no regulation. And that, to say proudly, that we made a decision a long time ago as a country in the New Deal and even before that to not have a total free market system in this country. We can be clear and proud that markets produce prosperity for us at the same time, in other words, as opposed to a different system, completely different system. But at the same time, it only protects everybody if there's an appropriate amount of regulation. That's number one. And then beyond that, we really have to talk about the kinds of things that are necessary in some detail. How would you be protected as somebody who's out there and somebody comes around and wants to essentially make a predatory loan to you? You know, what's the result of that, and what kind of protection do we need? And go on through and be very clear about what, and translate this in political terms, about what it means to have a mixed economy, one that's not just free markets for everybody.
I'm going to ask a leading question on the hope that one of you will take it up. Does anybody want to explain the unnaturalness of the market? Refute the idea that the market is a natural phenomenon that exists in the world? I mean, one of the... I'll go further.
Sounds like... Okay.
I mean, one of the things I think that is a story that needs to be told is that the market as baseline is an imaginary idea, as if there were a market that is the starting place of the conversation, and then everything on top of that is intervention. I think Cass Sunstein in his book on the Second Bill of Rights lays this out pretty well, that what is the market but a system of regulation of property rights, entitling certain people to certain claims protected by the rule of law, right? And that rule of law is drawn in a particular way with certain distributive outcomes that are foreseeable and intentional. And so the reordering of that is not intervention in some sort of non-natural way. Rather, it is a perennial contest politically in which groups vie for favor, but there is no inherent claim to authority simply by appealing to the market as sort of the natural baseline.
What you said.
And I would say also, I mean, there's so much work to be done on these questions now, and I think the American Constitutional Society it has really been key in the sense of getting people mobilized to start thinking about these very issues. I would like to urge people, in addition to looking at the state and local initiatives, the whole issue of globalization, which in the past was overwhelming and people thought, what can I do? There are things that can be concretely that are concrete steps, recently in a very interesting development, San Francisco, where else, and New York City have passed ordinances about purchases by the city of goods from abroad. In the city of New York, they said they would not purchase uniforms unless they, if they were produced under sweatshop conditions, and they came up with that they had to be produced under a living wage. And the same was in San Francisco on the issue. And people at one point said, that's just, the notion of being able to calculate a living wage on a global framework. How the hell can you do that? And, this is impossible. Turns out you can do that. There are economists who've come up with a way that it won't be the same living wage in the U.S., just like we calculate it differently for different cities. But you can come up with what a living wage is in a global way and figure that out. And we really now challenge, the bright thinkers in this country are now challenged, the activists, for how do you come up with global regulation. I mean, certainly we do have it with WTO and the World Bank, so what's our answer to that? When you have a Walmart, who basically the world's largest employer, who can shift to various factory suppliers around the world depending on who will pay the least amount. What do we do in return to try and have some fairness put into that system? And I would urge that we also start thinking a lot about these global codes of conduct. Right now, they've become essentially PR notions for multinational corporations, where they say, I've signed a global code of conduct, aren't I good? I'm going to abide by ILO's standards. By the way, it's non-enforceable, and there's no worldwide ability to enforce that on a particular country and a particular situation. There's a great lawsuit right now by the International Labor Rights Foundation against Walmart on behalf of workers in supplier factories in China and in several other countries, Bangladesh, saying Walmart has a code of conduct, but it's not being enforced. And Walmart's motion to dismiss is basically, you're not a third-party beneficiary of these codes of conduct, the workers. What did you think this was? Of course it's not enforceable. I mean, we have no duty or responsibility to enforce it on our supply. It's a wonderful brief because it essentially points out that these global codes of conduct, where they're monitored by company monitors or so-called independent monitors that are bought by the corporation, are not independent, but there's a world out there waiting for you all to work on. And there are things to do in it, and the answers are what are our response to the World Trade Organization. There's a lot of regulations going on, but it's not going on behalf of workers and working people in their communities.
Yeah, I agree in terms of the opportunity for us to contribute there. I think the most interesting work that relates to this has been done by progressive intellectual property lawyers and academics like Larry Lessig, who really have recognized the rules are artificial and they should reflect our values. And in that case, the values of creativity, free expression, and free speech. And they've really done a lot of very interesting intellectual and sometimes very practical work to reorder those rules, or at least propose an affirmative vision for reordering them in a way that reflects those values. And I think absolutely the same can and should be done in terms of the global trade regime.
I'm going to move from some of these more general themes to a few specific questions. I'm going to put several specific questions on the table. They'll be disparate, but we can discuss any one of them that you'd like. Number one, is there a role for litigation and courts in helping us solve these problems? Number two, how can progressives develop a coherent immigration policy that doesn't undermine economic security? And number three, how far can we get on these issues by discussing income supports, EITC, whatever's left of traditional welfare, as opposed to the larger structural issues of the structure of the labor market, education, the longer-term ordering of market outcomes? Any item on the menu. It's a la carte.
Well, I can try to take up the first, what's the role of the courts? And I think, recognizing the seeds of change is important. So, reclaiming international human rights principles as part of our national legacy is crucial. as Cass Sunstein's book points out, the United States played a pivotal role in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Really, you see FDR's legacy written all over that, and of course Eleanor Roosevelt played a crucial role in developing it. And yet the United States has moved away from the international human rights regime, first in terms of its enforcement at home because of Southern democratic fears of anti-lynching and civil rights laws, and then because of Cold War politics. But we need to reclaim that. When one reads the Universal Declaration, it's a remarkable document that includes a right to housing, a right to health care, a right to a living wage, labor rights, the full range of rights that we consider crucial to economic security, and that then make it possible to embrace mobility and greater equality. The other issue I would mention is pursuing state courts and constitutions. Similarly, the New York State Constitution is a remarkable document that includes an affirmative obligation of the state to care for the needy, not the language that I would have chosen, but an important principle. It includes a right to education, which has recently been declared, recognized, if not yet enforced by the state's High Court. It includes a right to shelter, which has been enforced with sporadic success. It includes a right to health care that we're very interested in exploring. And it includes important equality principles that I think are not yet fully realized. And then finally, I would say pursuing the principle in the law that equal opportunity is not treating everyone identically, but treating them all as equals. So when you think about Katrina, giving the same evacuation order to people who can hop in their SUVs as you give to people who don't have 2 quarters to take a bus out of town is not equal opportunity. It's identical, but it's not equal. So an interesting recent case that I'll mention in the Ninth Circuit was Jones versus LA, which held that the city cannot enforce its laws, criminal laws, against sleeping or sitting on park benches and other public spaces in the context of homeless people when the shelters and other places that homeless people would be able to decently sleep are full. That's an important principle. Of course, it's not a universal right. It applies only once the state or the city tries to bring its coercive force to bear against folks. But it recognizes that simply applying the same law to people, irrespective of what their circumstances are, economic circumstances in this case, is not true equality of opportunity. This is an Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment case, but the equality principle is important there. So I think there are a number of places that we have to work from in developing a more affirmative jurisprudence and legal approach to economic inequality and security.
I believe the Jones case is the one that relies, in essence, on the legal maxim that the law in its majestic equality prohibits the rich and the poor alike from sleeping under bridges. Right?
I'm going to try my hand at the last of the questions about setting priorities in looking at income supports and income disparities as distinct from making a hard look at structures in the labor market, and I'm going to beg the question because I don't think that choosing an either or is really necessarily helpful. And one of the I don't think it's not a luxury that I think we can afford. And one of the things I'm struck by each of my colleagues up here is the extent to which we're focused on state and local government and state and local constitutions and state and local courts as instruments for social change in a climate where at least some of us who are Washington-based don't have a lot of short-term help, maybe it's very short-term hope, that either going to the Congress or even the federal courts in many, many places are vehicles for that kind of pursuit of social and economic justice, no matter how we have been talking about it. So I would say that it very much depends on us and Judy's and each of our entreaties to all of you to be about as opportunistic as we can be about what are those strategies we're going to employ, and to the extent that looking at the very structures of the labor market are amenable to strategies of attack, I say you go for it. But where it isn't, you look for some of these other vehicles. And I don't know the answer to the immigration question. I think that's a tough one. I wish I did know it.
Peter, you want to take a...
Well, just very briefly to say what Alan said, but in slightly one sentence, different terms. The fact that the Supreme Court is not particularly an inviting place to go and bring a structural litigation, some Lawrence v. Texas and Grutter to the contrary notwithstanding, isn't the end of talking about litigation. And that's a way to just underscore what Alan said, and Judy about state and local. So we need a new mix, I would say, to everybody here, especially the law students, between and among litigation and policy, advocacy, and organizing, but litigation is a part of the answer. Secondly, to underscore what Judy said, but very strongly, we both need, in the short run, to take into account that the labor markets are broken and that people are earning too little and that there needs to be public policy at all levels to supplement that income, as well as minimum wage and things that are traditional. But we also need to be really looking very hard at the structural, working on the structural solutions, revitalizing the labor movement, these kinds of steps about globalization that have been discussed. On immigration, I'll stick a little toe in anyway, and just say that the current debate has been kind of a sad one for our country. I think McCain-Kennedy is the best we can do under these circumstances, and many of you have been active in supporting it. But it's not the best answer in a world in which there's a full and honest debate. We've been running, apart from what our policy is about legal immigration, which also could use a look, but I think has been, on the whole, a great success since 1965 and Ted Kennedy's leadership in really radically changing our immigration laws. We're a vastly more diverse country. We should celebrate that. It's absolutely wonderful. But on the illegal side, we're total hypocrites. The law of the land says that immigration is illegal. The practice of the land says, come on in. And somebody takes a step to say, we really ought to enforce the laws, and a whole bunch of employers and a whole bunch of sectors say, no, I need those low-wage workers that I can exploit. So there's something wrong with that picture, and we need a much more honest discussion about it.
On the immigration issue, too, I think the question, as I said before, about trade and how that fits into it, and our willingness to invest in the infrastructure of Mexico and deal with the fact that there should also be jobs that we've really drained, in a sense, and created a dynamic there that has not been healthy. But from the labor movement, SEIU's viewpoint, we need a path to legalization for the 12 million people who are here, who are working every day and earning a wage, and should be able to find protection and the right to be here out of the shadows. I know we've had a number of pieces of litigation that we've supported, that we've been in the middle of. We just, last year settled a $22 million wage case on behalf of janitors working in the supermarket industry in California. There are quite a number of undocumented workers, and of course now, people can just go in straight up exploitation by large employers. You saw the raids on Walmart or using subcontractors. We just have a case against UPS using contractors in their warehouse divisions for cleaning. People know, to get cheap labor, there is going on in this country another subculture of subcontracted work where not even the minimum wage standards are being respected. And so we call on you as litigators, too, on these questions to hold people accountable. There's a very interesting lawsuit or law that was passed in the last moments of the great Davis administration in California, essentially saying that companies that and I probably am not phrasing this quite correctly, but companies that knowingly, in a sense, employ contractors where they can tell by the amount of money they're paying them for their work that they're doing for them that they couldn't be meeting essentially the minimum wage standards, are liable for those violations. And you're seeing this around the country in astounding a number of instances. And as long as people are undocumented with no protection, we go out to pursue these cases. People cannot afford to come forward. They cannot afford to be witnesses. And it's a really sort of appalling, in the end, situation across the board. I just also want to take one moment to commend the American Constitution Society for also the things that you make decisions every day that make a real difference, and that is one of the big campaigns of the Two Americas is the hotel campaign that's going on right now by Unite here to raise the wage of low immigrant workers in the hotel industry. And American Constitution Society, instead of deciding where to be in Washington, D.C., could have gone to cheaper hotels and had to make an investment in a decision to go to a place that has a union contract and workers are respected and have a living wage and a good wage. So I just also want to thank you.
That was not a plant, but the sentiment is appreciated. Two additional questions. Why didn't Hurricane Katrina lead to greater awareness of these issues? And is there still an opportunity there to leverage that experience to get at some of these problems that we're talking about? Secondly, what can be done specifically for single women who are living in poverty or near poverty, who account for a growing number of the folks who are living at the margins?
Well, I guess I'll start. Katrina, I think, most fundamentally, we already, in one sense, without mentioning it, talked about it. It put a black face on poverty, and I think the country just, that's not the best card to play, if you will, in terms of getting an appropriate national reaction. And so, you had people who said, they quoted in the papers or going on television saying, "My goodness, I never knew." Well, where the heck were you? But I think they got tired faster. Just in general, anybody who works on natural disasters will tell you that there's a short window in any case for compassion and response. And so I think that's in the mix as well in terms of the answer. I do like to think that, just looking around at some of our friends who are advocates and organizers, that it shook them to get to wake up a little bit, and that I think there's a little bit more of a half-life, if you will, a little bit more staying power to some of the efforts that I've seen to renew and to rededicate to being supportive. And I imagine around the country, at the local level, that there's a lot of truth to that as well. So paid a horrible price for that if it is happening, and it's good. But the fact that it rapidly escaped, Anderson Cooper says that whenever, because he's one who really is committed to the Katrina story, that whenever he does it, his ratings drop by about 50%. So Katrina, in maybe a little bit of help, but shouldn't surprise us that it hasn't been the rallying cry. Besides that, it's at a time that's perfectly horrible in terms of national politics. So if you wanted a president of the United States who might speak up and lead the way in response to Katrina, other than the one speech that Gerson wrote for him that he went down there and delivered, this is absolutely the wrong one to have. So, he's going to bury it as fast as possible. On single women, The basic point, again, we've already talked about. You know, there's all this talk about marriage, and we didn't say this. It ought to be possible that marriage is not the only way out of poverty for a single mom. Work should be such that between the wage and the various supplements, EITC and child care, housing, other kinds of help, that a single mom can support her family and that they can make it. And we need that point to be made over and over again. Secondly, we have caused great rips in the social safety net in this country. And we've talked a good deal less about that this morning, so I'm particularly grateful for the question. Because any attack and set of initiatives on all of the issues that we have been discussing this morning needs to be based primarily about work and a decent income from work. But it is not complete. It is totally lacking in completeness if we do not have a decent safety net for everybody in this country. Single moms are still, if you make the list, and we're kind of all, shall we say, should chastise ourselves a little bit with the great statistics, awful statistics, but important statistics that you mentioned at the beginning, single moms are on that list. At the beginning of the Clinton administration, they were poor at a rate of nearly 50%. Through the years of the Clinton administration, with all the criticisms that some of us have about the welfare policy, nonetheless, poverty among single moms went down to about a third. Still nothing to write home about. Still quite a disgrace. But there was improvement in that. It's inching back up again. Well, poverty among single moms at a third? Excuse me, we better pay attention to that. So it's a combination of work and everything that goes with work, adequate child care and all of that, and saying that you're not going to have an arbitrary time of 5 years. In many states it's 2 years, 3 years, for income assistance for people with children who are not in a position to work. We need to go back and take a look at all of that.
Alan? Yeah, I'd just like to add on Katrina, in addition to what Peter has said, I'm profoundly disappointed with progressive elected leaders for their failure to talk about the racial and poverty and inequality implications of Katrina. You think about 9/11. 5 years ago, this happened. Devastating event. It's still every other sentence in every political speech that conservatives give. Katrina was almost not quite a year ago, and the ball was completely dropped. And you think about who was it that raised the issue of race with respect to Katrina? Kanye West, a rapper. And he was immediately treated as a pariah. It was an opportunity for a lot of progressive politicians to have a Sister Souljah moment in which they said, oh, well, it's, clearly it's not about race, it's about some other things. That was incredibly short-sighted, but it says an awful lot about the current leadership and their comfort level with dealing with these issues, which are supposed to be key to what our community is, our political community is about. And I think if you think about, had there been the kind of drumbeat of political messages over the last year, not only what a profound impact it could have had on the people of the Gulf Coast who are still suffering unbelievable deprivation, but what kind of communications environment we would be going into in the midterm elections could be completely different. So I think if there's a lesson to be learned there, it's that often on these issues, and I would put the judicial confirmations in the same boat. If we depend on the folks in elected office who are supposed to be our standard bearers, we're going to be disappointed in the short term, and really we're going to have to craft some of our own affirmative messages about those things.
I'd like to just add on that point Alan has raised, and Peter and Judy, this issue, SEIU has made a big investment in New Orleans. We're just opening up with our Change to Win Federation unions. As you know, we made some decisions last year as a number 7 unions to leave the AFL and concentrate more on see if we could put more focus on coming up with other innovative strategies in organizing and political work. But we put a big investment in opening up a training center in New Orleans for healthcare and construction workers, and sort of focus on what kind of jobs are coming back to New Orleans. Are these going to be good paying jobs, or are these going to be jobs where people are driven to down to the minimum wage? And recently when I was going through New Orleans with our local union leaders in there, what was interesting is the public housing units, which were not very damaged, as a number of these big units were not very damaged by the hurricane, but they have not been reopened. The very minimal repairs have not been done to them because there's been a decision not to let certain people back into New Orleans. And in many different ways, this is being reflected in what is occurring there. You have one public hospital left. That's it for all of New Orleans. You're privatizing a lot of the services and education, I'm sure, good when you've seeing that. And, in many different ways, the conservative plans are being played out in what people want to have happen in New Orleans. And you said it behooves all of us to sort of be turning our attention and investment there, because it also is an opportunity, frankly, and for us to really see if redevelopment can be done in a different way. On the single moms, I again want to come back to, from my labor perspective, saying collective action by single moms is often a very efficient way to get out of poverty. And that's why we've been focused on organizing and having these models for child care workers, for home care workers. These are big numbers, frankly, also. In 25,000 workers in Illinois at one time, and many of them single moms. The hotel campaign that's going on now, who are cleaning rooms across America? A lot of single moms living in poverty, being considered in some instances independent contractors, being assigned floors and being told you are being hired to clean this floor. You're not even supposedly employed by anyone as an employee. If we just pick up the curtain on any of the service industry jobs in America, you're going to see poverty and just abuses of what is supposedly already regulation in our society. And what I'm urging is that we, in our federal policies and state policies, figure out how to give union labor rights better ability to function so that single moms can have a collective voice at their workplace.
Well, whether or not we talk about a safety net or a basket of benefits or employee benefits that are in some way collectively bargained for, all of us been very clear that you can't just look at a livable wage for single women. And the question I took to be broader, actually, than just single moms, although that's a very important sector, without retirement security, for which, as Judy suggested, the employer community is fleeing almost as fast as they can flee providing health benefits without a defined benefit, a retirement benefit. You will see single women who, I never understand exactly what the good news is that women outlive men. I don't ever get that, but indeed we do. Single older women in poverty are a huge problem, but less so because of retirement security. And I see that resurgence of a problem looming really quite large. And so to the extent that we all think about policy answers to the diminution of that basket of benefits, whoever the provider is, I think is a really important investment of our collective resources.
We have about 5 minutes left in the panel, so I'm going to offer up a last pair of questions. You can take your pick. It's, again, a la carte. The first question is, what is the low-hanging fruit out there on these issues that what's the most immediate thing that we could do, both substantively and politically, that seems like the lowest hanging fruit that we ought to be doing, should be doing right now that we're not doing? Secondly, that's the short-term question. The long-term question is, what's the best we can hope for in terms of these issues in a country that is fundamentally dedicated to markets, to freedom of all sorts, right? In which that freedom necessarily entails, I think, some measure of inequality.
Well, look,
Go ahead.
I'll jump in.
One
Low-hanging fruit is healthcare.
Yes, absolutely.
60% of Americans believe that healthcare should be a universal right provided by government. A majority of those, when the question was asked specifically, are you willing to give up the Bush tax cuts in order to finance it? A majority said yes. I think that's almost certainly the low-hanging fruit. However, as the Massachusetts example shows, it has to be done in a way that provides equitable health care and that ensures that everybody has both the minimum level of care that they need and equal access to high-quality care. That's not what we have in Massachusetts, despite what I think is an important gain.
I totally agree. I mean, we've been watching, we have a Americans for Healthcare project where we are supporting litigation and initiatives around the country at the state and local level. And we get a lot of inquiries now in our office about we want to introduce something in our legislature or we want to do something locally. And we're, very much, I think there's been some interesting models developed like Massachusetts. Of course, we have the Maryland Fair Share Bill that is being litigated now. But we've developed models of how to navigate the whole ERISA preemption question. I think we can do right now, some very concrete things, and the political climate is there in a lot of locations to do it, leading up to what we all understand has to be the answer, which is a national program and national reform for universal affordable health care. But that's 2008, or probably 9. And then I think, the living wage ordinance question, which has been spread it was developed. That was, I think, the model that we want to use elsewhere around these kinds of initiatives. People went out, worked hard on the model, they experimented in states and localities, they litigated the defense, reformed the ordinance in order to withstand legal scrutiny, and now pretty much you can take that off the website and go into your local community, have a local community coalition, and raise the minimum wage to a living wage, and it's happening all across the country. So that, I think, is something that has a model. We've experimented, and what we've got to be doing is looking at more kinds of initiatives like that, where we throw them out, experiment with them, litigate the defense, and then move them onto the shelf where you get the website and everybody else can just pull them down and use them in the coalition. And this isn't low-hanging fruit, but I'm back to, if we could come up with the issues about global work and global ordinance around what is the living wage and start introducing into this country the notion that, yes, indeed, we can have a concept of a living wage, a global living wage, and that we can hold multinational corporations accountable. We'd like to, that I think is, the interesting thing is corporations come together and merge and consolidate. While it can be overwhelming, it also is an opportunity in the sense that, for example, we're trying to form a global union to organize big, large cleaning contractors and security firms worldwide, unions around the world working together at the same time, targeting one multinational. So I think that's not low-hanging fruit, but it's certainly a great opportunity.
Judy?
I would definitely agree that health care is as close to low-hanging fruit as we can get. And I think it's all the issue as a public policy initiative is also a monument to politics making strange bedfellows. Because as major employers, many of whom are also global employers, are providing health care and struggling increasingly, the auto industry is a monument, a further monument to this, in providing health care not only to their existing workers but to their retirees. They are much more interested in coming to the table to find universal solutions. And as we put pressure on some of the big boxes like Walmart, who are providing virtually nothing, or nothing, forget virtually, and are feeling the pressures in state and local governments, they're also coming to the table in some very interesting and unique ways. And there's something that Alan said that I don't want to lose. It's not only an access issue, it's also a quality issue. It's access to quality care. And if you want to go back and focus for just 1 minute on racial disparities, you just think about the extent to which there are racial disparities in the way health care is delivered in this country. We people of privilege in this room may have quality problems. It pales compared to what's happening to blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians.
Peter, last word.
Well, I'll tackle the last part, the other half of your question. I agree about all of the low or relatively low-hanging
Step
fruit.
ladder
I don't know,
fruit.
maybe Chiquita banana is low-hanging fruit. But, it's at the state and local level right now, everything that's been said. I don't think there's any reason not to say that it is possible and that we can commit ourselves, especially the young people who are here, to making sure that we end poverty in this country. And they've committed themselves in the UK to end child poverty. I was on a panel with the minister the other day about that. They're making very serious progress in that direction with different leadership, which means different organizing and different advocacy that pushes leadership, because that's how things happen. We can do that. We can require that the wealthiest people in this country pay their fair share of making this a decent society. And I think all of that is practicable and can be done within a future that we can foresee.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm pleased to...
I need to go home or my grandchildren are going to be...
Thank you. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.